Lieutenant Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she climbed down from the cockpit of her C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. The desert heat of Kandahar airfield hit her like a wall, but it was nothing compared to the cold stare she received from the fighter pilots gathered near the Flight Operations Center. "There goes the taxi driver," she heard one of them mutter, followed by low chuckles from his squadron mates. Sarah kept walking, her head held high, but the words stung more than she cared to admit. For 3 years, Sarah had been flying transport missions across Afghanistan, delivering supplies, evacuating wounded soldiers, and ferrying personnel between forward operating bases. It was dangerous work that required skill, precision, and nerves of steel, but to the fighter jocks, she was just another cargo hauler. Sarah had always dreamed of being a combat pilot. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she spent countless hours watching military aircraft practice overhead, imagining herself at the controls of an F-16 or F-18. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, encouraged her aviation dreams, but warned her about the challenges she would face as a woman in the military. When Sarah enlisted in the Air Force, she scored at the top of her pilot training class. Her instructors praised her natural flying ability, quick decision-making, and calm demeanor under pressure. But when assignment time came, the combat aircraft slots went to her male classmates, despite her superior performance scores. The explanation was always the same. Combat exclusion policies prevented women from flying fighter aircraft. Frustrated, but determined to serve, Sarah accepted assignment to transport aircraft. She threw herself into the role, becoming one of the most skilled C-130 pilots in her squadron. She could land on impossibly short airstrips, navigate through mountain passes in zero visibility, and handle emergency situations that would challenge pilots with twice her experience. But recognition never came. While fighter pilots were celebrated as heroes, transport pilots like Sarah remained invisible, performing the unglamorous but essential work of keeping the war machine supplied. The closest she came to combat was the occasional small arms fire during landing approaches, which she handled with the same steady professionalism she brought to everything else. The attitude of her fellow aviators hurt more than enemy fire. At the officers' club, fighter pilots would regale listeners with stories of aerial victories and close air support missions, while transport pilots were relegated to the sidelines. Sarah learned to endure the casual dismissals and condescending remarks, but deep inside, she burned with the desire to prove herself in aerial combat. Her chance came sooner than anyone expected. The morning of June 15th started like any other. Sarah received her mission briefing for a routine cargo run to a remote forward operating base called Firebase Alpha. The base was located in a mountainous region known for Taliban activity, but intelligence reports indicated minimal threat in the area. Sarah's crew consisted of her co-pilot, Lieutenant Mike Chun, Loadmaster Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, and Crew Chief Technical Sergeant Williams. They had flown together for over a year and worked as a seamless team. Mike was a solid pilot, though he lacked Sarah's instinctive feel for aircraft. Rodriguez could load cargo faster and more efficiently than anyone in the squadron, and Williams could fix anything that broke on the aircraft with whatever materials were available. The cargo manifest included medical supplies, ammunition, food, and a new communication system that Firebase Alpha desperately needed. The base had been experiencing communication blackouts that left them dangerously isolated from headquarters. Getting the new equipment delivered was critical to the safety of the soldiers stationed there. As Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection, she noticed unusual activity around the intelligence briefing rooms. Officers were moving with more urgency than normal, and she caught glimpses of serious conversations and worried expressions. When she asked the operations officer about it, he brushed off her concerns. "Nothing to worry about, Martinez. Just the usual chatter. Your route is clear, and you'll have a beautiful day for flying." Sarah wasn't convinced, but she had learned not to press too hard for information she wasn't clear to receive. She completed her inspection and began starting the engines, unaware that intelligence analysts were tracking a large Taliban force moving toward Firebase Alpha. The C-130 lifted off into the clear Afghan sky at 0800 hours. Sarah loved this moment of every flight, when the heavy transport aircraft defied gravity and climbed toward the mountains. The Hercules wasn't graceful like a fighter jet, but it had a solid, dependable quality that Sarah appreciated. It was built to take damage and keep flying, designed to land on rough airstrips and carry impossible loads. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Mike handled the radio communications while Sarah focused on navigation. The route to Firebase Alpha took them through a valley system that provided some protection from ground fire, but also limited their options if they encountered trouble. Sarah had flown this route dozens of times and knew every landmark, every potential hazard, and every emergency landing site along the way. The first hour of flight passed uneventfully. Sarah and Mike chatted about routine matters while Rodriguez and Williams performed equipment checks in the cargo bay. The C-130's 4 turboprop engines provided a steady, reassuring drone that experienced crew members found almost meditative. As they approached the halfway point to Firebase Alpha, Sarah noticed something unusual on the radio. There had been no communication from the base for over an hour, despite several attempts by air traffic control to establish contact. Firebase Alpha was supposed to check in every 30 minutes, but they had gone silent. Think their new comm system might be down? Mike asked, voicing the same concern that was troubling Sarah. Maybe, she replied, but her instincts told her something else was happening. Sarah had learned to trust those instincts during her years of flying in combat zones. The aircraft and equipment rarely lied, and when something felt wrong, it usually was. She tried raising Firebase Alpha on multiple frequencies, using every communication method available. Nothing but static answered her calls. The base had simply vanished from the airwaves, as if it had never existed. 20 minutes from their destination, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. A flight of F-16 fighters appeared on her radar, heading toward Firebase Alpha at high speed. Fighter aircraft only scrambled when there was serious trouble, and the fact that no one had warned her transport flight suggested the situation was developing too rapidly for normal communication procedures. Cargo 77, this is Viper Lead, came the voice of the F-16 flight leader. Be advised, Firebase Alpha is under heavy attack. Recommend you abort mission and return to base. Sarah's blood ran cold. If Firebase Alpha was under attack, the soldiers that would need the supplies she was carrying more than ever. The medical supplies alone could mean the difference between life and death for wounded defenders. But flying into an active combat zone in an unarmed transport aircraft was essentially suicide. Before she could respond, another voice crackled over the radio. It was Colonel James Mitchell, the commanding officer of Firebase Alpha, broadcasting on an emergency frequency. Any aircraft, this is Firebase Alpha. We are under heavy attack by Taliban forces. We have multiple casualties and are running low on ammunition. Request immediate resupply and medical evacuation. Our position is being overrun. The desperation in Mitchell's voice was unmistakable. Sarah had met the colonel during previous supply runs, and she knew him as a tough, experienced officer who didn't panic easily. If he was calling for emergency help, the situation at Firebase Alpha was dire. Sarah looked at Mike, seeing her own conflicted emotions reflected in his eyes. Every instinct told them to turn around and head for safety, but they both knew what duty demanded. The soldiers at Firebase Alpha were counting on them, and abandoning the mission might condemn good people to death. What do you think? Mike asked quietly, though they both already knew the answer. Sarah keyed the radio microphone. Viper Lead, this is Cargo 77. We're continuing to Firebase Alpha. Those soldiers need these supplies, and we're going to get them delivered. The F-16 pilot's response was immediate and sharp. Negative, Cargo 77. The LZ is hot, and you have no defensive capabilities. Turn around now. But Sarah had already made her decision. She pushed the throttles forward, increasing speed toward Firebase Alpha and whatever dangers waited there. She had spent 3 years being dismissed as just a transport pilot, but today she would prove that transport pilots could be heroes too. As the mountains of Firebase Alpha came into view, Sarah could see smoke rising from the valley where the base was located. Explosions flickered like deadly fireworks, and she could make out the distinctive contrails of rocket-propelled grenades streaking through the air. The battle for Firebase Alpha had begun, and Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was flying straight into the middle of it. Hashtag into the storm. The scene below Firebase Alpha looked like something from a nightmare. Sarah could see the base's defensive perimeter through her cockpit window, marked by a rough circle of sandbags and concrete barriers. Orange flashes erupted along the perimeter where Taliban fighters were launching rocket-propelled grenades and mortars. Return fire from the base defenders created streams of tracer rounds that looked like deadly fireworks in the afternoon sun. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, staring at the chaos below. "There must be hundreds of them down there." Sarah was already analyzing the tactical situation with the same calm precision she brought to instrument landings in bad weather. The Taliban had Firebase Alpha surrounded and were launching coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The base's helicopter landing zone, where she was supposed to deliver the cargo, was right in the middle of the firefight. "Cargo 77, this is Firebase Alpha." Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio again. "We see you overhead. The LZ is under direct fire. Do not attempt landing. Repeat, do not attempt landing." Sarah studied the terrain around the base, looking for alternatives. The standard approach to the landing zone would take her aircraft directly over Taliban positions, making them an easy target for small arms fire and RPGs. But about 2 miles east of the base, she spotted a flat stretch of ground that might work as an emergency landing strip. "Mike, what do you see at grid reference 7,849? She asked, pointing toward the area she had identified. Mike consulted his charts and studied the terrain through binoculars. "Looks like an old riverbed. Pretty rough, but it might be long enough for us. Problem is it's still within Taliban mortar range." Sarah was already calculating approach angles and distances. The improvised landing strip would require a steep approach over ridgeline, with no room for error. If she came in too high, they would overshoot into the rocks. Too low, and they would hit the ridge. But it was their only chance to get the critical supplies to Firebase Alpha. "Rodriguez, Williams, get up here," Sarah called back to her crew. The loadmaster and crew chief came forward, both experienced sergeants who had seen their share of difficult missions. Sarah quickly explained the situation and her plan to land on the riverbed. "Once we're on the ground, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before Taliban mortars find our range," she told them. "Rodriguez, I need you to figure out how to get that cargo unloaded and move to the base in record time. Williams, start thinking about what we'll need for a quick turnaround." Both sergeants nodded grimly. They understood the risks, but they also knew the soldiers at Firebase Alpha were depending on them. Sarah banked the C-130 into a wide circle, staying high enough to avoid most ground fire while she studied the approach to the riverbed landing site. The Taliban fighters below seemed focused on their assault on the base and hadn't yet noticed the transport aircraft overhead. "Viper lead, this is Cargo 77. Sarah radioed to the F-16 flight. "We're going to attempt landing an alternate site about 2 miles east of Firebase Alpha. Request you provide air cover during our approach and landing." "Cargo 77, I strongly advise against this course of action," the fighter pilot responded. "That area is crawling with hostiles, and we can't guarantee your safety." "Understood, Viper lead, but we're going in anyway. Those soldiers need these supplies." Sarah could hear the frustration in the F-16 pilot's voice when he responded. "Roger, Cargo 77. We'll do what we can to keep the bad guys off your back. Good luck down there." The first pass over the riverbed confirmed Sarah's assessment. It would be a challenging landing, but possible for a skilled pilot. The surface looked reasonably solid, though scattered rocks would make the rollout interesting. More concerning were the Taliban positions she could see in the surrounding hills. Once they landed, they would be sitting ducks for enemy fire. "All right, everyone, this is going to get interesting," Sarah announced over the intercom. "Strap in tight and be ready to move fast once we're on the ground." Sarah began her approach to the riverbed, diving the big transport aircraft toward the narrow strip of flat ground. The C-130 was not designed for tactical landings, but years of flying into rough airstrips had taught Sarah how to push the aircraft beyond its normal limits. As they descended through 3,000 feet, the first enemy fire reached toward them. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from Taliban positions and hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the aircraft. A few rounds punched holes in the C-130's aluminum skin, but the robust transport aircraft shrugged off the light damage. Taking fire from the left side, Mike reported, his voice tight but controlled. Sarah adjusted her approach to minimize exposure to the gun positions while maintaining the steep descent angle required to clear the ridgeline. The aircraft bucked and shook as more bullets found their target, but the engines continued running smoothly. At 500 feet, Sarah could see individual Taliban fighters running toward the landing site. They had realized what she was attempting and were moving to intercept the landing. In the distance, she could see muzzle flashes from Firebase Alpha as the defenders tried to provide covering fire. The ridgeline flashed beneath them with barely 50 feet to spare. Sarah pulled back on the controls, flaring the aircraft for landing while fighting a crosswind that threatened to push them off the narrow riverbed. The main landing gear touched down hard, bouncing twice before settling onto the rocky surface. "Reverse thrust now," Sarah shouted, pulling the power levers into reverse and standing on the brakes. The C-130 decelerated rapidly, rocks and dust flying everywhere as the big tires fought for traction on the improvised runway. They came to a stop just 200 yards from the end of the riverbed, close enough to the rocks that Sarah could see individual boulders through her windscreen. But they were down safely, and more importantly, they were close enough to Firebase Alpha to make the supply delivery possible. "Rodriguez, get that cargo bay open and start unloading," Sarah commanded. "Williams, keep those engines running and be ready for immediate takeoff." As the cargo ramp lowered, Sarah could see Taliban fighters moving down the hillsides toward their position. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the enemy closed to effective firing range. In the distance, explosions continued around Firebase Alpha as the main battle raged on. The first vehicle to reach them was a Humvee driven by a young sergeant from Firebase Alpha. Despite the intense fighting at his base, Colonel Mitchell had managed to organize a supply convoy to meet the aircraft. The sergeant's uniform was torn and bloody, and Sarah could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "Ma'am, Colonel Mitchell sends his compliments," the sergeant shouted over the engine noise. "Says you're either the bravest pilot in Afghanistan or the craziest, and he's not sure which." "Let's go with brave," Sarah shouted back, then turned to Rodriguez. "How long for the unload?" 6 minutes if we're lucky, 8 if we're not," Rodriguez replied, already directing the Humvee crew in loading the critical supplies. Sarah did the math in her head. 8 minutes would put them on the ground too long. Taliban mortars would find their range, and enemy fighters would reach positions where they could destroy the aircraft with small arms fire. They needed to find a way to cut the unloading time. "Williams, get back there and help Rodriguez," she ordered. "Mike, start plotting our takeoff run. We'll need every inch of this riverbed to get airborne with a reduced fuel load." Through her side window, Sarah could see more Taliban fighters emerging from concealment in the rocky hills. They were moving tactically, using cover and concealment as they advanced on the landing site. Some carried RPGs that could easily destroy the grounded transport aircraft. Above them, the F-16s began their attack runs on the advancing Taliban positions. The roar of jet engines mixed with the crack of cannon fire as the fighters tried to keep the enemy at bay. But there were too many targets spread over too wide an area for the fighters to eliminate them all. 3 minutes. Rodriguez called from the cargo bay. Sarah watched a group of Taliban fighters reach a position about 800 yards away and begin setting up what looked like a mortar tube. Once that weapon was operational, they would be able to drop high explosive rounds directly on the aircraft. The math was becoming impossible. That's when Firebase Alpha's defenders launched their own desperate gambit. Led by Colonel Mitchell himself, a squad of soldiers broke out of the base's defensive perimeter and began advancing toward the Taliban mortar position. It was an incredibly risky move that left their own positions undermanned, but it was the only way to buy time for the supply delivery. Sarah watched through binoculars as the Firebase Alpha soldiers engaged the Taliban fighters in a fierce close-quarters battle among the rocks. Tracer rounds streaked back and forth, and she could see explosions from hand grenades echoing across the valley. 2 minutes, Rodriguez shouted. The sound of incoming mortar rounds whistled overhead, impacting about 100 yards from the aircraft. The Taliban had brought their weapons into action, and they were walking their fire toward the landing site. The next salvo would be closer, and the one after that would likely score direct hits. 1 minute, Rodriguez called. Last pallet coming off now. Sarah began her engine rune-up, preparing for what would be the most dangerous takeoff of her career. She would have to get the heavy transport aircraft airborne from short, rough strip while under direct enemy fire. Failure wasn't an option. Too many people were depending on her. The final medical supply crate hit the ground, and Rodriguez began securing the cargo bay. Sarah released the brakes and began rolling forward, using every inch of the riverbed to build up takeoff speed. Ahead of her, the rocky obstacle at the end of the runway seemed to grow larger with each passing second. The unexpected battle, Sarah pushed the throttles to maximum power as mortar rounds exploded closer to the aircraft with each passing second. The C-130's engines roared as she fought to build airspeed on the short, rocky riverbed. Through her windscreen, she could see the wall of rocks at the end of the improvised runway growing larger by the second. Airspeed building, Mike called out, his voice tight with concentration. 50 knots, 60, 70. A mortar round exploded just 50 yards to their left, showering the aircraft with rock fragments and dirt. The blast wave rocked the big transport, but Sarah kept her hands steady on the controls. They needed at least 90 knots to attempt takeoff, and they were running out of runway fast. 80 knots, 85. Mike continued. Sarah could see individual rocks in the obstacle ahead. In about 10 seconds, they would either be airborne or they would be scattered across the Afghan landscape in pieces. There was no middle ground. 90 knots. Sarah pulled back on the controls, willing the heavy aircraft into the air. The C-130 lifted off with barely 50 yards to spare, clearing the rocks with room to spare. But their troubles were far from over. As they climbed away from the riverbed, Sarah heard a sound that chilled her blood, the distinctive whistle of approaching aircraft. But these weren't friendly fighters coming to escort them home. The radar warning receiver in the cockpit began screaming, indicating they were being painted by hostile aircraft targeting systems. Multiple contacts bearing northwest, Mike shouted, studying the radar display. Fast movers, definitely not ours. Sarah's mind raced as she processed this information. The Taliban didn't have aircraft, which meant these contacts belonged to someone else. As she watched the radar screen, the truth became clear. They were facing enemy fighters, probably Pakistan-based aircraft that had crossed the border to support the Taliban assault on Firebase Alpha. Viper lead, this is Cargo 77, Sarah radioed urgently. We have multiple hostile aircraft inbound from the northwest. Estimate 6 contacts heading directly for us. Cargo 77, this is Viper lead. We see them on our scope. We're moving to intercept, but they'll reach you first. Recommend you take evasive action and head for the deck. Sarah was already pushing the C-130 into a steep diving turn, trying to put terrain between her aircraft and the approaching threats. But a lumbering transport plane was no match for fighter aircraft in terms of speed and maneuverability. If those enemy pilots were competent, the C-130 would be an easy kill. The first enemy aircraft appeared as a dark speck against the mountain ridges, rapidly growing larger as it approached for an attack run. Sarah could see it was some type of light fighter, possibly an F-7 or similar aircraft. Not state-of-the-art, but more than capable of destroying an unarmed transport. Missile launch. Mike shouted. Brake right. Sarah threw the C-130 into the most aggressive turn the aircraft could handle, pulling G-forces that threatened to stall the big transport. Behind them, she could see the smoke trail of an air-to-air missile streaking through the space where they had been just seconds before. But the evasive maneuver had cost them precious altitude and airspeed, making them an even easier target for the remaining enemy fighters. Sarah could see 2 more aircraft setting up for attack runs, and she knew the C-130 couldn't survive another missile engagement. That's when years of transport flying experience gave Sarah an idea that no fighter pilot would ever consider. Instead of trying to outrun the enemy aircraft, she would use the C-130's unique capabilities to her advantage. Mike, I need you to deploy flares on my command, she said, turning toward a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside. Rodriguez, Williams, get ready for some serious turbulence. Sarah dove the transport aircraft into the canyon, flying below the ridgeline in a maneuver that would be suicidal in a fighter jet. The C-130's slow speed and excellent low-speed handling allowed her to navigate the tight confines of the canyon, but the enemy fighters would have to slow down dramatically to follow her. The canyon walls flashed past the wingtips as Sarah threaded the needle through the rocky passage. She could hear the roar of jet engines above as the enemy fighters tried to track her movement, but the steep walls and tight turns made it impossible for them to get a clear shot. Flares now, Sarah commanded. Mike triggered the aircraft's defensive countermeasures, filling the canyon with hot flares designed to confuse heat-seeking missiles. The narrow confines of the canyon created a perfect environment for the countermeasures to work, forming a wall of false targets that would confuse any missile systems. But Sarah wasn't done yet. As they emerged from the far end of the canyon, she spotted something that made her heart race. A Pakistan Air Force F-7 fighter diving toward them for a gun run. The pilot had anticipated her exit point and positioned himself perfectly for a close-range attack. In that split second, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her as a transport pilot. Instead of continuing her evasive maneuvers, she turned directly toward the attacking fighter. The enemy pilot, expecting the transport to continue running, was caught completely off guard by Sarah's aggressive move. As the 2 aircraft closed at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour, Sarah timed her maneuver perfectly. At the last possible second, she pulled the C-130 into a sharp climb while simultaneously deploying the aircraft's cargo ramp. The massive ramp door, designed for dropping supplies, opened directly into the path of the oncoming fighter. The F-7 pilot tried to avoid collision, but at such close range and high speed, he had no time to react. His aircraft struck the C-130's cargo ramp at over 300 miles per hour, tearing off the fighter's wing and sending it tumbling out of control toward the ground below. Holy shit, Mike shouted. Did we just ram a fighter with our cargo door? Sarah was already maneuvering to engage the next threat. The collision had damaged the C-130's cargo system, but the aircraft was still flyable. More importantly, she had just discovered that her supposedly defenseless transport plane could be turned into a weapon. 2 more enemy fighters were approaching from different directions, clearly coordinating their attack to prevent her from using the terrain again. But Sarah had learned something important about aerial combat that her fighter pilot colleagues had missed. It wasn't always about speed and firepower. Sometimes tactics and creativity could overcome superior technology. She spotted a second fighter setting up for a missile shot and began another impossible maneuver. Instead of diving for the ground, Sarah pulled the damaged C-130 into a climbing turn that brought her above the fighter's position. The enemy pilot, focused on achieving missile lock, didn't notice the transport aircraft until it was too late. Sarah timed her attack perfectly, opening the main cargo doors just as the fighter passed beneath her. The doors, designed to withstand tremendous aerodynamic forces, caught the F-7's vertical stabilizer and ripped it completely off the aircraft. The fighter immediately went into an uncontrolled spin and crashed into the mountainside. 2 down, Sarah announced calmly, as if she had been shooting down enemy fighters her entire career. The remaining enemy pilots were clearly shaken by the loss of 2 aircraft to what should have been an easy target. Sarah could see them regrouping at a safe distance, probably trying to figure out how a transport pilot had just destroyed 2 of their fighters using cargo doors as weapons. But the reprieve was temporary. The enemy still outnumbered her 4-1, and they would quickly adapt to her unconventional tactics. She needed to even the odds before they figured out how to counter her improvised combat techniques. Sarah spotted another opportunity as one of the fighters moved to a position above her aircraft. The F-7 pilot was trying to set up for a diving attack that would be impossible to counter with her cargo door technique. But Sarah had noticed something during the previous engagements that gave her another idea. The C-130 carried emergency equipment that included several life rafts in pressurized containers. If deployed at the right time and place, those containers could become kinetic weapons capable of damaging or destroying an aircraft. Rodriguez, I need you to prepare the emergency life rafts for deployment, Sarah called back to the loadmaster. When I give the word, I want you to jettison them through the crew door. Ma'am, those rafts are for emergencies, Rodriguez protested. Sergeant, this is an emergency, Sarah replied grimly. She began climbing toward the fighter above them, using the C-130's superior rate of climb to close the distance. The enemy pilot, expecting another defensive maneuver, was caught off guard by the transport's aggressive approach. As the 2 aircraft passed within 200 feet of each other, Sarah gave the command, "Deploy rafts now." Rodriguez triggered the emergency equipment, sending 3 inflatable life rafts shooting out of the aircraft directly into the path of the approaching fighter. The F-7 pilot tried to avoid the obstacles, but one of the heavy containers struck his aircraft's intake, damaging the engine and causing immediate loss of power. The crippled fighter began trailing smoke and losing altitude. Sarah watched as the pilot ejected safely, his parachute deploying as the aircraft crashed into the valley below. 3 enemy fighters destroyed in less than 10 minutes, using nothing but cargo doors and life rafts. Sarah Martinez had just rewritten the book on aerial combat, proving that sometimes the most effective weapons were the ones nobody expected. Against all odds, the 3 remaining enemy fighters regrouped at a safe distance, clearly rattled by the destruction of their squadron mates. Sarah could see them circling like cautious predators, trying to figure out how to attack a transport aircraft that had just proven deadlier than most fighter jets. Viper lead, this is Cargo 77, Sarah radioed to the F-16 flight that was still several minutes away. 3 hostiles down, 3 remaining. They're keeping their distance now. Cargo 77, say again your last, came the incredulous response. Did you say you've engaged enemy fighters? Affirmative, Viper lead. 3 confirmed kills using unconventional methods. Request you expedite your approach. I'm running out of tricks up here. There was a long pause before the F-16 pilot responded. Cargo 77, we're pushing maximum speed to your location. Hold on for another 5 minutes. 5 minutes might as well have been 5 hours. The enemy fighters had spread out into a wider formation, making it impossible for Sarah to engage them with her improvised tactics. Worse, they seemed to be learning from their mistakes, approaching more cautiously and coordinating their attacks. Sarah studied her options while keeping the C-130 in a gentle turn that prevented the enemy from achieving a stable firing position. Her aircraft had taken damage from the collisions, and several warning lights indicated problems with hydraulic and electrical systems. The cargo doors were partially jammed, limiting her ability to use them as weapons. Sarah, we've got problems, Mike announced, pointing to the engine instruments. Number 3 engine is running rough, and we're losing hydraulic pressure on the primary system. The battle damage was beginning to take its toll on the aging transport aircraft. Sarah could feel the controls getting sluggish, and the C-130's performance was degrading with each passing minute. Meanwhile, the enemy fighters remained fresh and fully armed. That's when Sarah spotted something that changed everything. A 4th enemy aircraft approaching from the east. But this one was different. Larger than the F-7 fighters, it appeared to be some type of transport or cargo aircraft. As it got closer, Sarah realized it was actually a modified transport plane that had been converted into a gunship. The aircraft bristled with weapons pods and cannon mounts, clearly designed to provide close air support to ground forces. It was heading directly for Firebase Alpha, where the battle was still raging. If that gunship reached the besieged base, it would slaughter the defenders who had no defense against aerial attack. "Mike, do you see that gunship heading for Firebase Alpha?" Sarah asked. "Yeah, I see it. That thing will massacre our guys if it gets into firing position." Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to any rational pilot. Instead of continuing to evade the three fighters, she turned toward the approaching gunship. Her damaged C-130 was no match for the heavily armed aircraft in conventional combat, but conventional combat was something Sarah had already abandoned. "Rodriguez, Williams, get up here," she called her crew. "I need to know what emergency equipment we have left." The two sergeants quickly inventoried their remaining options. The life rafts were gone, the cargo doors were partially jammed, but they still had several items that might prove useful in Sarah's unconventional approach to aerial warfare. "We've got the emergency slide, fire suppression system, and about 200 pounds of emergency rations in metal containers," Rodriguez reported. Sarah studied the approaching gunship, calculating intercept angles and timing. The converted transport was larger and more heavily armed than her C-130, but it was also slower and less maneuverable. If she could get close enough, she might be able to disable it using the same tactics that had worked against the fighters. "Here's what we're going to do," Sarah announced. "I'm going to approach that gunship from below and behind. When I give a word, Rodriguez, I want you to deploy the emergency slide. Williams, prepare to jettison the emergency rations through any opening you can find." Both sergeants looked at her as if she had lost her mind, but they had learned to trust their pilot's judgment during years of dangerous missions together. Sarah began her approach on the enemy gunship, staying low and using the mountainous terrain to mask her movement. The gunship crew was focused on the target ahead, Firebase Alpha, and didn't notice the approaching C-130 until Sarah was less than a mile away. As the gunship pilot became aware of the threat and began evasive maneuvers, Sarah closed the final distance with a precision that would have impressed even veteran fighter pilots. She had calculated the approach perfectly, positioning her aircraft directly beneath the gunship's tail section. "Deploy slide now," Sarah commanded. Rodriguez triggered the emergency evacuation slide, which shot out from the aircraft like a massive banner. The inflatable slide, designed to allow rapid evacuation of passengers, expanded directly into the gunship's propellers and tail rotor assembly. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The gunship's rear propeller shredded the slide material, but the tough fabric wrapped around the propeller shaft and jammed the mechanism. The aircraft immediately began vibrating violently as the damaged propeller created massive imbalance. But the gunship was still dangerous, and its pilot was fighting to maintain control while bringing his weapons to bear on Sarah's aircraft. That's when Williams proved why crew chiefs were considered the backbone of the Air Force. The sergeant had positioned himself at the crew door with a canvas bag full of metal ration containers. As the two aircraft flew in close formation, he began throwing the heavy containers directly into the gunship's engine intakes. The solid metal cans, each weighing about 5 pounds, were sucked into the aircraft's turbine engines with devastating effect. The first engine failure occurred within seconds as metal containers destroyed the delicate turbine blades. The second engine followed shortly after, leaving the gunship with insufficient power to maintain flight. Sarah watched as the heavily modified aircraft began a controlled descent toward the valley floor. Its mission to attack Firebase Alpha effectively ended. "4 down," Sarah announced with grim satisfaction. But the 3 surviving F-7 fighters had used the distraction to set up their own attack. As Sarah turned away from the disabled gunship, she found herself facing 3 aircraft approaching from different directions in a coordinated assault. This time, there would be no escape using terrain or unconventional tactics. The lead fighter fired a missile from maximum range, forcing Sarah into violent evasive maneuvers that stressed her already damaged aircraft. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel as systems failed under the strain. The C-130 was reaching the limits of what it could endure. "Sarah, we can't take much more of this," Mike warned, pointing to the engine temperature gauges. "Number 3 is definitely failing, and number 4 isn't looking good either." Sarah knew he was right. The old transport aircraft had given everything it had, but it was no match for 3 determined fighter pilots in a conventional engagement. They needed help, and they needed it fast. That's when she heard the most beautiful sound in military aviation, the distinctive roar of American F-16 engines at full power. Viper flight had finally arrived, diving out of the sun like avenging angels. Cargo 77, this is Viper lead. We have visual on 3 hostiles engaging you. Break left, and we'll clean them up. Sarah turned the damaged C-130 away from the approaching fighters just as the F-16s opened fire with their 20mm cannons. The sky filled with tracer rounds as the American fighters engaged the 3 remaining F-7s in a brief but violent dogfight. The outcome was never in doubt. The F-16 pilots were among the best in the world, flying superior aircraft with better weapons and training. Within 2 minutes, all 3 enemy fighters had been destroyed, their pilots either killed or forced to eject over hostile territory. Splash 3 more, Viper lead announced. All hostiles destroyed. As the F-16s formed up to escort the damaged C-130 home, Sarah finally had a moment to assess what had just happened. In the space of 24 minutes, she had destroyed 4 enemy aircraft using nothing but cargo doors, life rafts, emergency slides, and meal containers. She had prevented a massacre at Firebase Alpha and proved that transport pilots could fight as effectively as anyone. Cargo 77, this is Firebase Alpha. Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio. "Don't know what kind of voodoo you just pulled up there, but you saved our bacon." The Taliban assault broke off when those fighters went down. "We're secure." Sarah smiled as she nursed the damaged C-130 toward home. The fighter pilots who had dismissed her as just a transport pilot would never look at cargo aircraft the same way again. She had rewritten the rules of aerial combat and earned the respect that had been denied to her for so long. But more importantly, she had proven to herself that courage and creativity could overcome any odds. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was no longer just a transport pilot. She was a warrior who had found her battlefield in the skies over Afghanistan. #Heroes Recognition, the landing at Kandahar Airfield was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her 3 years of flying transport missions. As the damaged C-130 touched down on the main runway, she could see crowds of people gathering near the Flight Operations Center. Word of the aerial battle had spread throughout the base, and everyone wanted to see the transport pilot who had shot down 4 enemy aircraft. "Look at that," Mike said, pointing through the windscreen at the assembled crowd. "Half the base is out there waiting for us." Sarah felt a strange mixture of pride and embarrassment as she taxied the battered aircraft toward the parking area. The C-130's aluminum skin was peppered with bullet holes. The cargo doors were twisted and partially torn off, and one engine was barely running. It looked like the aircraft had been through a war, which was exactly what had happened. As Sarah shut down the engines and began the post-flight checklist, she noticed something that made her smile. Among the crowd of ground personnel, mechanics, and curious onlookers, she could see the same fighter pilots who had dismissed her as just a taxi driver earlier that morning. Their expressions ranged from disbelief to awe to grudging respect. The crew chief who met them at the aircraft was a veteran master sergeant named Johnson who had seen everything during his 20-year career. But even he seemed stunned by the condition of Sarah's aircraft. "Lieutenant, what the hell happened to my airplane?" he asked, walking around the damaged C-130 in amazement. "Enemy contact, Sergeant. We'll need a full inspection before this bird flies again," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Enemy contact," Johnson repeated. "Ma'am, this looks like you flew through a blender. Are you telling me you did all this damage while delivering supplies?" Before Sarah could answer, Colonel Robert Hayes, the wing commander, arrived with an escort of senior officers. Hayes was a legendary fighter pilot himself, with combat experience dating back to the Gulf War. Sarah had never spoken to him directly, but his reputation for demanding excellence was well known throughout the base. "Lieutenant Martinez," the colonel said, returning Sarah's salute. "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened out there. My intelligence officers are telling me stories that sound like something from a movie." Over the next hour, Sarah provided a detailed debriefing to Colonel Hayes and his staff. She described the Taliban assault on Firebase Alpha, her decision to land on the riverbed, and the subsequent aerial engagement with enemy fighters. She kept her account factual and professional, but she could see the disbelief in the faces of her listeners. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Colonel Hayes said when she finished. "You used cargo doors to destroy 2 fighters, killed a third with emergency life rafts, and brought down a gunship using an evacuation slide and meal containers?" "Yes, sir. That's correct," Sarah confirmed. "And you did all this while flying an unarmed transport aircraft?" "Yes, sir." The C-130 may not have been designed for combat, but it turned out to be more versatile than anyone realized. Colonel Hayes studied Sarah carefully, as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth or suffering from combat stress. Finally, he turned to his intelligence officer. "Major Williams, what do we have from other sources?" "Sir, we have confirmation from Viper flight, gun camera footage from the F-16s showing the final 3 kills, and radio intercept from enemy forces confirming the loss of 4 aircraft. We also have testimony from Firebase Alpha that Lieutenant Martinez's actions directly prevented the base from being overrun." The colonel nodded slowly. "Lieutenant, what you accomplished today goes far beyond what anyone thought possible. You saved Firebase Alpha and eliminated a significant enemy air threat using tactics that—" He paused, shaking his head. "Well, using tactics that don't exist in any manual." Word of Sarah's aerial victories spread beyond Kandahar airfield with remarkable speed. Within hours, her story was being discussed in Pentagon briefing rooms, Air Force academies, and pilot training schools around the world. Military historians would later call it the most innovative aerial combat of the 21st century. The media attention that followed was overwhelming. Sarah found herself featured on the covers of military magazines, interviewed by news networks, and invited to speak at aviation conferences. The shy transport pilot who had been ignored by her fighter pilot colleagues was suddenly the most famous aviator in the Air Force. But the recognition that meant the most came from her fellow pilots. The same fighter pilots who had dismissed her as a taxi driver now sought her out for advice on combat tactics. They wanted to understand how she had turned a lumbering transport into an effective fighter aircraft. "Martinez, I owe you an apology," said Captain Brad Stevens, one of the F-16 pilots who had made jokes about transport pilots. "What you did up there, I've never seen anything like it. You fought that battle like a warrior." Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, but she was more interested in the practical implications of what had happened. Her unconventional tactics had worked, but they had also revealed serious gaps in military thinking about aerial combat. "The thing is," Sarah explained to a group of fighter pilots during an informal briefing, "we've been thinking about air-to-air combat in very narrow terms. Speed and firepower are important, but they're not everything. Sometimes creativity and understanding your aircraft's unique capabilities matter more." Her insights led to changes in pilot training programs and aircraft design. Military engineers began studying how transport aircraft could be modified to serve dual roles as cargo haulers and combat platforms. Pilots learned to think more creatively about using their aircraft systems and equipment as weapons. Sarah's crew, Mike Chun, Rodriguez, and Williams, were also recognized for their role in the historic battle. All 3 received commendations for their courage and quick thinking under fire. Rodriguez was praised for his rapid cargo handling under enemy fire, Williams for his innovative use of emergency equipment as weapons, and Mike for his steady performance as co-pilot during the most dangerous aerial engagement any of them had ever experienced. The damaged C 130 that had carried them through the battle was retired from active service and placed on display at the Air Force Museum. A plaque beneath the aircraft reads, "This C-130 Hercules transport aircraft was flown by Lieutenant Sarah Martinez on June 15, 2012, when she destroyed 4 enemy aircraft in aerial combat using unconventional tactics. The engagement proved that heroism and innovation can overcome any odds." 6 months after the battle, Sarah received orders that would have seemed impossible before her aerial victories. Instead of being assigned to another transport squadron, she was selected for fighter pilot training. The combat exclusion policies that had prevented women from flying fighters had been lifted, and Sarah's demonstrated combat effectiveness made her an ideal candidate for the program. "I guess this means no more jokes about taxi drivers," Colonel Hayes said as he presented Sarah with her new orders. "You've earned your place among the fighter pilots, Lieutenant. Make the most of it." Sarah graduated at the top of her F-16 training class and went on to become one of the most respected fighter pilots in the Air Force. But she never forgot the lessons learned during her time flying transports. The experience had taught her that every aircraft, every mission, and every pilot had hidden potential waiting to be discovered. Years later, as a squadron commander, Sarah would tell new pilots, "Don't let anyone tell you what your aircraft can't do. Don't let them define your limits based on what's written in a manual." Sometimes the most important battles are won by people who refuse to accept that something is impossible. The story of Lieutenant Sarah Martinez became legendary in military aviation circles. It was studied in war colleges, analyzed by tactical experts, and retold by pilots around the world. But for Sarah herself, the most important lesson was simpler. Courage isn't about having the best equipment or the most firepower. It's about doing what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. The transport pilot who had been dismissed as just a taxi driver had proven that heroes come in all forms. Sometimes they fly sleek fighter jets, and sometimes they fly lumbering cargo planes. What matters isn't the aircraft you're flying, it's the heart of the pilot at the controls. Firebase Alpha was eventually evacuated, and its personnel reassigned to other bases, but the soldiers who defended it never forgot the transport pilot who saved their lives. Colonel Mitchell, who survived the Taliban assault, would later write, "I've served with many heroes during my military career, but I've never met anyone who combined courage, creativity, and skill the way Lieutenant Martinez did that day." She proved that heroism isn't about rank or aircraft type. It's about character. In the end, Sarah Martinez had accomplished something that went far beyond shooting down enemy aircraft. She had changed how the military thought about combat, inspired a generation of pilots, and proven that determination and innovation could overcome any challenge. The woman who had dreamed of being a fighter pilot had become something even better, a legend.